A car rental agency. They picked me up. So now I'm in a car rental. I actually get it, all right? They pick me up. I go there, and I'm driving. And I'm realizing I have absolutely no idea how to operate this vehicle. It is a BMW hybrid. Have you ever seen this thing? It should not be on the road. There are so many buttons on this thing, so now I'm trying to figure out where the turn signal is, where the radio is. My wife calls, oh, I got my hands-free connected, thank God. That was good. First thing I asked the guy how to do the hands-free. My wife says, that's really great, you're moving. She says, just don't press the ejector seat button. And I'm like, they have that in this car? No, I'm really anxious. So let me tell you, folks, I really wanted to be here, okay? I really wanted to be here. Thank you. Well, you know, and thank you for your patience and your indulgence, Chief, and Commissioner. I have some notes. Let me just grab my notes here. I was really organized yesterday. Thank you. Okay. Now, the description of this session speaks to issues that I think many of us in this room, including our guests, are concerned about. It's the issue of policing and community relations. And you know, I think it would be understating the fact that there are some challenges out there. And so this session is really dealing with and asking the question, what challenges are being faced by police services in Canada as they serve an increasingly diverse constituency? That's the question. But let me begin by reminding us, and you've all heard of this before, Sir Robert Peel. Sir Robert Peel has been quoted as saying, and this is a common, we hear this, it becomes almost like a cliche in many ways, the police are the public and the public are the police. But we sometimes forget to read the rest of that sentence. It went on to say that the police, being only members of the public who are paid to give full attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interests of community welfare and existence. So the police, they have some challenges, but it's also very clear here that the Peel, that just about every police officer or leader have this thing etched in their brain in terms of what he said about the police being the public and the public being the police. There are issues to be dealt with. So I hope to have an open and frank conversation on these issues with our guests. So let me quickly introduce our guests this morning in no particular order. So when I say you can just wave and acknowledge. Chief Jean-Michel Blais. He was appointed to the position of Chief of Halifax Regional Police in 2012. And prior to this appointment, he was a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for 25 years. Chief Blais, welcome.
Thank you.
Yes. And there's another backstory between you and I. You and my wife, you've been having an email relationship. Cynthia Reyes?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
It is not spicy, contrary to what Madame Jimenez has said.
Yes, my wife has written a book,
yeah.
And she apologizes for not having a copy, but she's going to get it to you. And Chief Blais, if you should know, Chief Blais has been very outspoken about the impact and the effects of PTSD. And this is the book my wife has written about. And I think it's very much dealing with some of the issues in first responders and police services. And so, Chief Blais, thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Vince Hawkes. There he is again. He became Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police in March of 2014. He assuming this leadership of one of North America's largest police services. Commissioner Hawkes oversees frontline policing, traffic and marine operations, emergency response, and specialized and multi-jurisdictional investigations throughout the province of Ontario. and in his spare time, I don't think he has any. Welcome, Commissioner.
Thank you, and I'm just glad you got the car off the 401. That's OPP area.
Oh, you would not believe how happy I am I got it out the 401. Chief Eric Jolliffe. He's a local guy, born and raised in York Region. He began his career with the City of Edmonton Police Service back in 1979, and in 1981 he returned to York Region, came back home, and joined the York Regional Police. Over his 33-year career, the chief has served in a variety of functions, and in December of 2010, he was appointed the Chief of Police. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
Okay. And finally, but certainly not least, Chief Mark Saunders. Chief Saunders was appointed Chief of Police for the Toronto Police Service in May of 2015, so he's fresh. And I'm sure there are days he feels like he's been there a lot longer than a year. The Toronto Police Service employs more than 5,300 police officers and 2,700 civilian employees, and he has an annual budget, and this is always a contentious issue, of nearly $1 billion. It's the largest municipal police service in Canada and the 5th largest in North America. Ladies and gentlemen, Chief Mark Saunders. Well, gentlemen, the question I think I'd like to open up with is one I'll just throw out to all of you, and feel free to jump in, and don't go too long because I know you have a lot to say. I just want to sort of warm up the room a little bit. And perhaps you could answer the question, really, what challenges are being faced by police services in Canada as they try to serve an increasingly diverse constituency? And we can start at the end. Chief Blake?
First off, look up at this group of people, police chiefs up here. What's missing, aside from hair on my and Mark's heads? Women, that's right. And for me, and I just yesterday in Halifax, addressed the Atlantic Women in Law Enforcement, about 170 female police leaders. And I put the challenge out to them, get involved, right? And we need, before we can even look at diversity in all of its intricacies, we have to look at the most common bit, and that's the equity portion, right? And we need to have more women up here. If I'm not mistaken, I don't know how many chiefs there are in Ontario. I know there's Jennifer down in Peel, and I dare say there's a few others. I know out in the Atlantic region, we only have one female police chief, and that's in Fredericton. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. So gender for you is a critical issue.
Absolutely.
Among other things, obviously.
Yeah, and we take a look. We've got 20% in Halifax Regional Police of our police officers are women. That's great. Okay, that's around the norm for the country. The highest, to my knowledge, gents, feel free to add into it, is SPVM in Montreal with 33%. Okay, and that's probably the highest in North America, for that matter, because in the United States, the average is only 13%.
Okay.
Those are my opening
Okay,
comments
thank you.
there.
Thank you. Commissioner, your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to this group today. It's, the question is very appropriate when we talk about modernizing police, because as you look at someone like me with a white man, gray hair, that's the typical stereotype of policing for the last number of years. And we realize that we're not serving our communities the way we should without having the diversity in-house. And but that's a big challenge because it flows to how we recruit and then how we promote within our organizations. And that big shift is happening right now, right across Canada, when it comes to looking at other ways to have that community engagement piece, not only for the operational side of what we need to do, but for the recruiting side. We need to be more diverse when it comes to that. And not only just from the female perspective, because we're exactly the same numbers as what Jean-Michel spoke about. But we have systemic barriers within our own organizations that prevent folks from actually taking on new roles and responsibilities. In Ontario Provincial Police, we have a lot of challenges when it comes to First Nations peoples and the territories that we police. And it's very difficult to get people to join our organization because of these systemic barriers that are currently out there, where we have certain demands for education and certain demands that don't meet the needs of that community. So we're at a point now in Canadian history where the police leadership has never been more open to shifting where we need to go and starting from the process, start at recruitment and go right to the top within the organization. And that's a focus right across the board, and that's what most agencies and police chiefs are committing to right now.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. I'm going to come back to that systemic barriers issue because I think that is clearly something that is real, and it's important, I think, for certainly organizations and like the police to acknowledge those systemic barriers. The question is going to be, what are you doing about removing those barriers? So we'll talk a bit about that. Okay, Chief Jolliffe, your thoughts in terms of you see some of the challenges that are facing municipal police services.
Right. So perhaps I could just talk briefly about York Region for just a moment. For those that don't know York Region, we're a population of about 1.2 million people, of which about 45% were not born in Canada, and by 2030 that will change to about 63%.
That's right, yeah.
So significant change in a community, and so important to understand people who come to this country and their thought process around what our industry is all about. So I know that many of you know that there are countries around the world that the trust and confidence in their police is not very strong. There's a fear of police. So for us at York Region, it's so important for us to do what that young lady said earlier about building that trust and confidence and that dialogue and community engagement in a community. So
that would be the challenge. One of the biggest challenges, building trust within communities, would be a significant challenge.
Yes.
Okay, Chief Saunders, please, your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Hamlin. And, you know, I would say that if we're going to talk about a paradigm shift, it would be the fact that policing has to change from the warrior to guardian. And when I say that, although it's oversimplified, what that requires is a lot of work. It requires redefining what our measuring tools are for success, what does success look like for law enforcement, understanding that not using commodity-based as a measurement of performance, but looking at social investment for each and every officer. Are you developing relationships on a daily basis? Do you understand what your responsibilities are when you're within the community? Are you looking for partners to help enhance community safety? So the social cost of policing, I think, is one of the biggest things we have to look at. It no longer is it what you do, it's how you do what you do. And in order to do that, you have to look at social cost with every decision you make in policing, and then using that as an equilibrium to make sure that what we're doing is in fact right and public deems it to be valuable.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, let's drill down a little bit deeper then in terms of what I think it was. I think it was Commissioner Hawks talked about systemic barriers. Where does that play in terms of this closing this gap that appears to have developed and continues to, quite frankly, I think is widening between the public, segments of the public, specifically certainly in this city and maybe even right across Canada, between racialized minorities, Indigenous people, and people who perceive themselves to be equity-seeking groups. There's that gap that appears between the police establishment and the communities. How do you propose to close that gap? And I'm not going to call in anyone necessarily, but I'd like to have a conversation about this. So please jump in and give us some thoughts here. How do you go about closing that gap, if indeed you acknowledge there are systemic barriers within the service for change? Go ahead.
First off, let's be very clear as to where that gap or how that gap has been developing over the last few years, okay? And if we go specific to what's been going on in the United States, the Ferguson The Ferguson effect is what I call it. Right? In the States, the Ferguson effect refers to the reticence of police officers, particularly white police officers, to be involved and be engaged with the black community. Right? Up here, the Ferguson effect, in my mind, means something just slightly different. And it means what happens down there matters here. It has an instance. And we're dealing with now a very, very highly informed, globalized society. And in fact, I'd say that in the history of humankind, we are the most over-informed and least reflective society ever. Think about the amount of information. And not only do we have that, like how many of you are on your phones right now, whether it's tweeting or answering phones, and that's fine, there's no problem there. But what I'm saying is that we get all this information. How do we process that information? How do we deal with that information? And that is a major game player in what we're dealing with. So what we see is we see things happening in the United States. We see things happening up here, but particularly in the United States, the whole issue of police-involved deaths. Okay, the Washington Post came up with a list, and they're doing an ongoing list now. They said upwards of 974 people have died as a result of interactions in the United States with police in 2015. Okay? So the United States is 10 times the size of Canada. How many do you think people died here in Canada as a result of interactions with police? Anybody got a number? 21 in 2015. Okay? More law enforcement professionals killed themselves in 2015 than there were people who were involved in police-involved deaths.
Okay, Chief, thanks for that, but you didn't answer the question.
That's true.
Okay.
Too. Well,
and I want to get
that's my political side there.
No, hold that thought. I want to go to Chief Saunders then, okay? If indeed you acknowledge there are systemic barriers within the services that you work with, and it may be having a detrimental effect in terms of building this trust that has already been articulated at this table that is required or even being eroded, how do you close it? What do you do, Chief?
Well, first
Chief
off,
Saunders?
I could go ad nauseum at the intense training and the modification and the training that we have done to make sure that our officers have an understanding of bias and the roles that it plays in, and to make sure that it doesn't conflict with your behavior. But something that I think that is bigger, that I'm excited about, is the fact that we took a leap of faith this year, and so the chair, Andy Pringle, and I devised a transformational task force. And normally within policing, whenever we want to make those modifications, we sit down in a room with police experts, and we redefine the direction and the vision that we're going to go in. This time, we took a balance. We took 7 members from the public, with each having a different lens and different issues, as well as 7 top-notch police officers, and we sat down and together decided to say, what should policing look like? What should the roles and responsibilities of policing look like? And so when we have community at grassroots with saying, we want involvement in policing, I think that's a bold step, but I think it's the right step. If we're going to define public value, this is true value, because the public are right at the grassroots of the development of how the police service is going to be looking in the future to help reduce exactly what you're talking about.
Let me follow up on this, Chief Saunders. There have been, over the years, a number of initiatives to close that gap. There have been reports. There have been consultative committees. There have been research, reports, conversation with the service, whether it's a Toronto service and any other service. Still, the gap exists. So what's going to be different this time around, you think, especially the Toronto service, with this transformational process that's going through? What's going to be different from everything else that people have seen in the past?
And that's a fair question, and I can answer it this way. When I joined 33 years ago, I can tell you what the top 3 issues were. Number 1, the budget and the high cost of policing. Number 2, how we deal with people that live with mental health issues. And number 3, how we deal with racialized communities. And I'll tell you today, these are the exact same top 3 things.
Yeah.
It's not what you do, it's how you go about doing it. And so this is an opportunity of looking at it from a completely different lens, a more transparent lens, which I think is something that is critical, and that's something the public is asking for, not asking for, but demanding for. So what you have is a higher level of transparency and accountability because the public is in at the table for all of the decisions making for this report and how it should look, and then the implementation, which is also going to be out there in public. So I think when we add these factors, we've got a better opportunity for success, and it's success through actions, not through symbolism, not through words on a page, but through tangibles. And you will see over time whether or not we're legitimate with what we say we're going to do, because legitimacy is going to be answered through our actions over a long period of time.
Yeah.
I know that. And whether or not we account for those that misbehave, and whether or not we also celebrate those that do a good job, because the vast majority do, but unfortunately police agencies aren't good at branding their own product. So new policing has to involve that equally as well, because if we wait for the media to do that, it's going to be a long wait.
Okay. Chief Jolliffe, I saw you were nodding in agreement. If there is agreement there, terrific. Give us a sense of what this may look like, or what this could look like in your police service in York Region, in terms of this transparency, this openness, if indeed there needs to be a transformation. I don't know whether or not you're going through the similar transformational process that Toronto is, but certainly there must be some conversations internally about how you're going to police differently because of the new realities in York Region.
So, you know, we have been for years actively engaged in our communities.
In what way?
In 2010, created a 10-member diversity, equity, and inclusion unit. So that unit, every single day, and there are several members from that unit here today, every day that unit is in our diverse communities, connecting, building partnerships, working in collaboration. And from our sense, anyway, that this is, we're on the right track. I think folks need to understand that this kind of work, working in community, is very labor intensive. So what I see as a challenge that and we will all talk about the challenge of the economics of policing. Mm-hmm. You need to know that our industry it's all about, it's labor intensive, it's all about connecting to community. You need the resources to connect. So when we are foisted into the situation of the economics of our business and cutbacks and rollbacks and those sorts of things, what it forces policing to do is to go back to its core mandate.
Which is?
Law enforcement,
okay.
Emergency response. If you read the Police Services Act, there's nothing that says community engagement in terms of a core responsibility. It's something we do.
But one can assume, based on the Act and the things within the Act in terms of providing efficient and effective policing, you need to have community engagement. So it doesn't have to be written down in black and white.
No, absolutely. And that's why I say, because of the I'm concerned because of the economics that it's going to cause police services across this country to retract from that very, very important task of connecting to its communities. And we know in York Region how important it is to dialogue, connect, build collaboration and partnerships to ensure that our community feels safe and comfortable interacting with its police service.
Yeah. I want to get Commissioner Hodgson on this, because you have a larger sandbox, so to speak, in which to play with. And the challenges are probably no less or greater than what's happened, let's say, in the city of Toronto, often only 3 million people. So what do you do? What does your service do in terms of, first of all, acknowledging that there are systemic barriers, and I think we'd like to know what you're doing about getting rid of those barriers, breaking those walls, because people are talking about it. But also, what are you dealing with that trust issue?
Well, first of all,
bridging that gap.
First of all, in order to build trust, you have to invest in communities. And that means in OPP's jurisdiction, there's 323 different communities that we police across this province. Mm-hmm. So there's no one solution that's going to work in every single community. But what we've done from an investment standpoint, and Chief Jolliffe is very accurate when it comes to it costs money in order for us to do that. But we feel that it is a priority. The only way we're going to be successful is to invest in the communities. And I'll give you a great example. We have a provincial liaison teams that go out. There's 40 to 50 of them right across the province, and they do all of that community engagement piece in all of our Aboriginal communities, in all of our communities where there's potential for dispute, in all those communities where we need to work together with social agencies and deal with those social injustices that are out there. And they do this ahead of time. So when there is a time of crisis, then we already have that relationship that's being built. And I'll give you the example of the community of Pekanjikam, where the highest suicide rate in youth in the world, not in Canada, in the world. And it seems like there was a disconnect between the social agencies and what's going on. It's not the police responsibility to go in and solve the suicide issues because they're built on a whole pile of other things. But we did it anyways. We went in to build relationships with the communities, and as a result, there's an investment in that community. And years ago when we were marched out of the community, the police were marched out of the community over some disputes. Just this summer, we were actually invited back to stand and shake hands with the community members, and this has never been done in the history. Why? Because the community believes the fact that by the police being there and working together on non-police issues, developing programs for children, and looking at the Aboriginal issues on the First Nations awareness, and have an understanding what the police role is, that you actually build a better relationship with that community. And as a result, the community then can thrive, and then you can bring in industry, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all connected. Everything we do in policing is connected to the issues in the community. So we have to invest in that community and eliminate those resistance or those barriers that have been there over the years, and even admit that we don't understand, admit that we were wrong in the past, admit the fact that we need to grow and have a better understanding about the challenges.
Are you prepared to admit that today? That maybe things that you have done, even as a police leader, even as a police come up through, that you may have done things wrong?
I can guarantee I've done things wrong. When you look at my own personal career from the last 32 years, my mindset and how I was started off as a young recruit is totally different than my mindset today. Because of that awareness piece, because of that understanding and experience, and dealing with many, many mental health issues, the challenges internally, dealing with the use of deadly force, and having gone through my own personal challenges when it comes to that, and realizing that in order to help others, you have to help yourself. The organization has to be strong and has to have that wellness piece in order so that we can help others. And understanding the challenges of individuals with mental health is a huge task for policing. But we have to do that. We have to invest in a strategy, a mental health strategy that not only looks at our own people, but looks at the challenges of the community and work together with those things.
And how you interact with that community. Chief Blay, I mean, I want to come to you. Okay, I want to give you an opportunity to again answer that question. But in the context of Halifax, okay, historically there have been challenges in Halifax between Black Nova Scotians, all right, and the community. I mean, I've spent time there, and let me tell you, when I was going there as a kid visiting, I mean, it was known as the Mississippi of the North. Okay, that was the attitude towards Black Nova Scotians and the rest of Nova Scotia. And there was a real tension between the police and that community. Does that tension still exist today? I suspect it probably is, all right? But what are you doing? What do you see as things that need to be done in terms of closing that gap, if indeed there are those systemic barriers to change within the service? What's happening in Halifax that you think that's working, and what do you think could be done here in other parts?
There is always that tension that exists between police and any community, whether it's a racialized community, non-racialized, what have you, just by virtue of the role of police, which is to enforce the law, so to speak. Specific to Halifax, and you mentioned about the African Nova Scotian community there, just some history. We're very proud of the history that the African Nova Scotian community is the very first Black community in Canada, coming from the southern states through the Underground Railroad, coming from the Caribbean, and at one
the
point
Maroons.
That's right.
In
fact, one of the at one point it was the largest Black community in Canada. That was many years ago, and of course things have changed. So we've had several issues. Kirk Johnson, for example, was a prize fighter who got into a situation, and he came across a police officer that had a bigger personality than he did, and ended up being that there we learned a significant amount about the challenges that we've had. We've had also a roundtable on violence in 2007. We've had an update, a roundtable 2.0 in 2014 that has told us some of the specific challenges that are going on right now. What we do is we go out, we have the, we don't have the same resources that either of these cities do, but we do have, or province in the case of the OPP, but we have a very active engagement session. One of the things that, that we do is we try to redefine exactly what is community policing. A lot of people think that it is playing basketball with the kids, think that it's all these other community engagement pieces. As per, and you mentioned Peel at the beginning, what it is, it's we've got a problem. We had 5 young men who lost their lives this year as a result of shootings. We've also had women who have lost their lives. Nothing to do with the African Nova Scotian community, but we've been engaging those communities as well. We sit down, talk to the people, and say, okay, what can we do to deal with these issues? And a lot has come back to the whole issue of perceptions of there's an issue, there's a crisis of confidence in there where that policing is not involved. Getting back to what Vince said, there's an expectation that police, by virtue of the fact that we are the only government agency, with the exception of paramedics, we call them EHS in Nova Scotia, and fire, that is open 24/7. Right? And that's a real big challenge because a lot of people expect us to do absolutely everything. Mental health is a key component, youth at risk is another, addictions is also another one for us, but also the whole issue of finances. So I guess it comes down to the questions. What do you folks want to see in the years to come for your policing? How much are you willing to pay for it? And as I had my youth ambassador came to my table, asked me afterwards, he says, what do you think about the possibility of police in Canada going without firearms? Okay? Those are the type of questions that need to be raised by the community, just as Erin Kotler said about that community social engagement piece, to say, how do you want your police services to look like in the years to come? And I think that's the key of it.
And I know there's been a lot of conversation about what the future of policing look like, and you can do all of these mind maps that takes it out. You know, if we had to remove the firearms from police officers, what would be the impact? And you can start mind mapping this thing out in terms of what would be the overall impact in terms of safety. There have to be a redefinition of what safety is. All of those things, it does have an impact. But gentlemen, I got to talk about the elephant in the room here. And the elephant in the room here is the whole issue of racial profiling and the impact that it's had in terms of fracturing that relationship that you, all 4 of you have indicated that's so important in terms of trust, dealing with communities within your own jurisdiction. So let's talk about that. How damaging do you think that practice, that policing tool, in quotes, do you think has had on this relationship, this trusting relationship, that all 4 of you said that is absolutely vital? Chief Saunders.
I would say that there are 2 key elements. Number one, when we talk about eroding public trust and the subject of racial profiling, there's definitely a direct correlation between the two. Being responsible for the men and women thrown, and one of the things that was done right away was added a 3rd day of training, full day of training, as well as ongoing training, which talks about implicit bias, which I spoke about earlier on, as well as the IDI, and incorporating that.
The IDI is Intercultural Development Inventory, Intercultural Competence Development, just to give because you use an acronym, sorry.
So, and then on top of that full day of training, what we've done is we've got a PACER advisory committee with a room full of civilians as well as police officers that have looked through all of our procedures and policies to see, through an anti-racism lens, to see if there's any bias, implicit or not, within the procedures, looked at our training, all of our training, to see whether or not there is bias, implicit or not, and helped us formulate the proper procedures, policies, training, and it's an ongoing process. And the vast majority of public are saying, well, it's the accountability piece. What about that? Well, when it comes to that, we're moving towards the body-worn camera so that we can have an opportunity for looking at the objective encounters that are out there. Now, body-worn cameras will not be the end-all to this, but it will be certainly a solution so that the objective content can be there so that people can have those conversations. So we've got cameras in our booking halls, we've got cameras in all of our police vehicles, and we're moving towards making sure that the officers have an ability of being accountable for on a day-to-day basis. And I'm excited about that because when I pontificate that the men and women are doing a good job, I want to be able to validate that through objective evidence, and that's what I'm hoping the outcome will be.
Good. So thank you. I'm going to come back to some comments you made in your response because I want to build on that. But I want to hear from the other members of the panel here in terms of the racial profiling. Let's call it what it is. It's racial profiling. It was racist in terms of how it targeted certain individuals, and I think it's been admitted that there were some racist elements involved in that. And it created some real problems in communities. Let's talk about that. Do you think that really eroded trust? And what are you going to do to close that gap down? Anyone, if you can jump in.
Sure. You know, Mark spoke about, you know, about the eroding public trust, and I think all four of us, our attention is on improving public trust. And, you know, Mark alludes to what his service is doing, and you know, I think that there's two angles to this. There's the external piece that needs to go on. There's an internal piece that needs
What's the
to
external
go on.
piece?
So the internal piece for us is around.
Is it external? You're doing external or internal? What's the external piece?
So one of the things that we do, and we have done for a while, is acknowledged past actions. For example, since we're here, we host an Asian Heritage Month, and in there we acknowledge the Chinese head tax. We have Black History celebrations where we acknowledge the history of the Black community. And these things, I think, we host an international day, so the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So this is based on the actions in South Africa, and as many of you are aware, that the police took brutal action against a community there. 66 people were killed in an action there that was wrong, was unjust. But as a police service, we recognize that, and we bring community together to build relationships again based on that. So
what has been the
outcome? So that's on the external side. So the internal side.
It's internal.
So we're working on cultural competencies. So just as
what does that look like, Chief?
So one small thing that we do as an organization is all our new recruits, every single one of them, because we have built significant relationships with our diverse communities in York Region. Every single one of our officers goes out into a diverse community and spends the day, and then is required to come back as a class to talk about their experiences.
What happens during that day?
So they're interacting with their community, or we're going off to places of worship. So we have a very significant places of worship program where we go to many of the different religious institutions in the York Region to understand culture. And they come back, our members come back to talk about that in a classroom setting.
Okay.
So just continually, we have work to do, we have more work to do, but continually try to encourage our members to understand the community that they serve.
Good. Because I want to come back to impact in a few minutes, okay? Because we can do a lot of these things. You can do these celebrations. You can celebrate Black history. You can celebrate Indigenous Day. You can celebrate this. But the question is, what impact? Are the officers experiencing the differences as opposed to simply being exposed to the differences? Because that's a very different song, very, very different. It's very different. So I'd like to hear from both Vince and Chief Blay on this, because it is an issue in these communities in terms of policing tools that's used, and that may be effective in some regards, but it's also been found to be ineffective, but it's also done exactly the opposite of what you believe is required to do good policing. So how much of an impact do you think this has had on the relationship between your service and these communities that seem to feel that were targeted? And I'm speaking specifically, Commissioner, the Indigenous community for sure, but certainly Chief Blay, within the African Nova Scotian community, there are probably issues there as well. So I'd like you to comment on those, please.
Sure, I'll begin because we've had a lot of experience with the challenges of dealing with the Indigenous communities. And number one, as Chief Jolliffe said, you have to acknowledge that there were mistakes done in the past. Once you do that, then you start to build a relationship forward. And we've had our experiences and our challenges with not only the Ipperwash Inquiry and our officers killing an unarmed Aboriginal man. And but the whole challenge is, how do we, number one, admit the mistakes, but how do we go forward and build with those communities? And that's done through a long experience of reaching out to those communities. And I think we're very successful in that. We still got a long way to go, but we're very successful at that, because I'll tell you now, if certain issues happen across this country, we're all connected because of those relationships that we've built. Now, it's not the total answer, because we've got a long way to go, but I'll tell you that in my time, in the last 10 years, there's been a significant shift. And it's not only because of our officers attending powwows and dealing with this stuff in the community. We're talking about embedding into the communities. We're talking about working hand in hand, long-term solutions and major projects that we've organized. One is called Project Sunset and Project Journey out of Northwest region, where there's direct connection to the First Nations communities and partnership on a number of fronts, and not just policing issues. And so it's that type of reach out that's allowed us to be a little more successful. But you have to admit that in the past, there was some challenges.
Yeah.
There was some racial issues that happened. There's some discrimination that happened, and so on.
Are you suggesting it's not happening today?
No, I'm just suggesting that,
Okay.
that our officers are a little more aware now.
Okay.
And when it happens, I think you'll find that police leadership are less tolerant and are willing to take on the challenges of those that abuse what we feel is the right thing to do in our society.
So, yeah.
And
So I'm
I
hearing
think
about
that's
accountability
important.
is what you're talking about. The accountability
correct.
factor has gone up. Chief Blay, your thoughts?
Now I'll add some spice, as Ms. Jimenez has said. First off, what is policing? Policing is dealing with those challenges that people themselves should not, would not, and could not deal with, okay, for various issues, whether it's a drunk driver on the 401, or it's a dog barking incessantly in the middle of the night down on Dundas Street, or somebody who's been beaten up, whatever, okay? These are human interactions. Human interactions are, at their very basis, highly, highly complex. So we're dealing with a problem that is very, very complex. We also have a tendency in our society to think about things as being feeling true, as opposed
what?
feeling true, as opposed to being empirically true. Okay, so we have to look at these things with a strong dose of empirical skepticism and not cynicism. Okay, because cynicism is not going to lead us anywhere. Okay, but looking at the facts and seeing what's going on. That being said, there have been errors in the past. There are errors being committed today. There will be errors in the future. Okay, but the question is, what are we doing to deal with those errors? Okay, when it comes down to systemic barriers, are we hiring enough? No. But what do we want to do when we hire people? Halifax, for example, we are, and I don't like the term, but we're overrepresented in terms of that. But it's really easy for us because only 7% of our population is a visible minority. So it's really easy to do that. I speak to, on a regular basis, our African Nova Scotian and African Canadian police officers, and they're frustrated as anything because they're hearing the stories, they're hearing these anecdotes, and it makes it seem like it happens everywhere. It doesn't happen everywhere. We're talking about millions upon millions of interactions that occur every year in Canada, in Canadian policing. Let's forget about the American situation for the moment. Okay? A lot of great work is being done. And what we're doing, our goal is to be able to get to the point where we get, maybe in the past, I'm just throwing this out here to quantify it, okay, 30% of the interactions were race-based. Now that's going down even further and further to the point where it's 15% or it's 10%, okay? Are we ever going to get to the point where it's 0%? I don't think so. Why? Because we're dealing with human beings, and as human beings, we all have cognitive biases, we have implicit biases, and we have overt biases. And I've had people look at me and say, oh, you're just a white guy. They don't know that I'm Cree background from my father's side. My mother was Jewish. Okay? So these are things that it takes time to get out there, and what happens is that you end up getting that turnover, and it's creating that culture within a police organization that sustains itself and that develops on a continual basis the confidence of the community.
You brought up the word culture. And I don't think anyone would disagree with you, Chief Blais, that the vast majority of interactions with police officers and the public are positive. They're good outcomes.
Not if you're arrested.
Okay, not everyone would agree with that comment, but there is that. But there is a fact, is that those negative outcomes, whether someone is injured, someone is, deadly use of force comes into play, but it becomes part of the culture within policing. And you, sir, you've talked about that culture of policing that would turn its nose upon an individual like you would go through PTSD, for example. The culture itself, so the culture of policing, there needs to be a shift within the culture in terms of not just what is accountable, who's accountable, but in terms of what is allowed and the thinking. So I think that's the way, that's what I'm hearing you saying. But speaking of culture, and this is to our Ontario Police Services, the provincial government now has brought in regulations around the collection and retention of data. It speaks to the racial profiling. As of January 1st, the services will have to have policies in place and procedures in order to make that regulation live. The question I'm asking the three chiefs, the two chiefs and the commissioner in place here, what's going to be different come January 1st in terms of how your officers will interact and deal with the public because of this regulation? Sir.
Well, I'll start. First of all, there's an extensive training piece to this, and when people talk about training and what officers need to do when it comes to training and dealing with the interactions with the public, they often refer to de-escalation, and there needs to be more de-escalation training. But I have to tell you that we've been doing de-escalation training since the day I came on the job. It's just a matter of the perspective of how much you need to de-escalate. Having lived through an individual pointing a firearm at my head, I'll have to tell you, I'm not thinking about de-escalation at the time. We've already surpassed where that line is on de-escalation because we're talking life-threatening issue here. So the government has passed a regulation. Part of that regulation is extensive training of every one of our officers, including online portion, including scenario-based training. And that's a positive step in that any training that we can give our officers to enhance that ability to be able to make those decisions and to do it according to the regulation, according to the law, is a benefit. The challenge that we're faced is lots of those interactions that have happened in the past are simply good police work. They're good police work when it comes to interactions. And what the confusion out there is not only the confusion of the public understanding that piece, but it's also internal. The confusion of officers understanding where their role is. And so that training piece is what's going to assist that. Okay, so that's a key piece to it.
Good. Chief Jolliffe, in terms of your service, are you ready to implement come January 1st?
Absolutely.
How is he going to do it?
So, as the commissioners indicated, probably all police services in the province of Ontario now have begun the training of their members for them to fully understand the collection of identifying information, and this for folks to know what that training kind of looks like. Our officers that have dialogues around Appelian principles, as you have mentioned there, sir, policing duties under the Police Services Act, criminal versus racial profiling, first impressions, implicit bias, snap judgment, critical thinking and self-reflection, think, act, explain, intelligence-led policing, articulable cause, investigative detention. So they're going through a whole series of, it's pretty much scenario-based, and going through a whole series of things. And I'm hoping at the back end of this that all police officers in the province of Ontario will have a completely new understanding of their relationship and their interacting with the community.
Okay, thank you, sir. Chief Saunders, same question. Day one, January 1st, what will be different? What will look different? What will the public see?
Well, I mean, we've already started, and we started this journey 3 years ago with the PACE Advisory Committee, which consists of civilians, racialized men and women from the community, with a privacy commissioner, with people that are in the mental health industry, and we've sat down and we've worked on developing a procedure in accordance to this very procedure that's being developed. When it comes to the training piece, adding a third day of training that is directly related to dealing with people who live with mental health issues, directly related to community engagement, bringing in members of the public to help with the training and talking about the impact and influence that officers have in the community and having those hard conversations. These are things that we're doing, and we're going to continue to do that, as with all the other things that I've said on top of that. So we're ready. When the law's there, we will enforce the law with the guidelines and rules that are put before us.
Good, good. Well, let me close by, I'm going to share a quote with the room and to you. It's a quote, and this is quite recent. And there have been times when law enforcement officers have been the face of oppression for far too many of our fellow citizens. In the past, the laws adopted by our society have required police officers to perform many unpalatable tasks. While we obviously cannot change the past, it's clear that we must change the future. The first step in this process is for law enforcement to acknowledge and apologize for the actions of the past and the role the profession has played in society's historical mistreatment of communities of color. And this is from Terrence Cunningham. He's the chief of police in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and he's president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. What I'm hearing you saying here, gentlemen, I think there's an acknowledgement that you may not collectively, not you personally, but collectively, may not have always done, quote unquote, the right thing, whatever that is. But you're also open to change. I'm hearing that you're open to input. But it's also a reality here that this is going to cost something, whether it's financially or socially for everybody. And so what I'm hearing you saying is that there's a role to play, not just for police service, but also for the public to be involved in this conversation. So I want to thank you for being here, but if you have one last comment, Chief Blais, I've been told I'm going to get the hook in about 2 minutes.
All right, well, I'll make it real quick. Chief Cunningham also said that with regards to the injustices of the past, and we're talking about long past as well.
Yes,
okay?
yes.
Okay, police cannot be held accountable for it. However, for what happens in the future, police have to be accountable to it.
Yeah.
And that's what I agree with.
Good, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, our panelists, thank you very much.